It's already 11.
Start.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Association of Indian Research Scholars 6th e-lecture. We are back once again with a topic that seems to be quite popular as we have received around 320 registrations. We are glad that you have all joined us for an in-depth analysis and insights by Professor Arun Kumar Patnaik, Dean of School of Social Sciences, University of Hyderabad, on understanding Gramsci's political thought. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. I am Ariba Ahsanath Mausam, Senior Research Scholar, Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad. I would now like to request one of our executive members from Shillong, Evangeline Nonclaw, PhD Research Scholar, Department of English, University of Hyderabad, to walk us through the inception of Association of Indian Research Scholars. Over to you, Evan.
Thank you, Ariba. Good morning. The Association of Indian Research Scholars, also known as AIRS, is the brainchild of Ariba Ahsanath, the president of this association. It was created to bring together like-minded, intellectually inclined, and enthusiastic research scholars of our generation, and to collectively increase our knowledge base while also interacting with the best minds in the world. To this end, we have garnered the support of some of the best Indians, including Professor Mohammad Muazzam Ali, Professor and former HOD, Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad, Professor Zoya Hassan, Professor Emerita, Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Professor Alfredo Toro Hardy, retired Venezuelan diplomat, scholar, professor, and public intellectual, Dr. Aparna Devare, Assistant Professor at the University of Hyderabad, Professor Rajan Harshe, Professor of Political Science and former Vice Chancellor of Allahabad Central University, and many scholars from across the world, including Nuno Rodriguez, Director, Quixote Global from Madrid, Spain, Paul Szymanski from Space Strategy Center, Carnegie Mellon University, New Mexico, USA. The aim of an association like AIRS is to not only provide a platform for young scholars to connect with experts, but also to have intellectually stimulating and interactive sessions with them. In order to make that happen, we aim to host webinars, e-lectures, seminars, talks, book discussions, and distinguished lectures. In the future, we also intend to expand towards doing conferences, seminars, symposiums, and book discussion panels. Through these mediums, AIRS intends to promote a seamless and harmonious interaction and engagement between the social sciences and humanities communities in the country. It also aspires to bring together people to hold discussions, debates, and conversations on theory, research methodology, research ethics, research practices, and methods to expand the research community and to bring everyone within one ambit. The future of AIRS holds dynamic experiences. We intend to bring the Indian community closer to the international community, not only through lectures and seminars, but also through publication. AIRS intends to focus on the most relevant issues in the world and the various pressing scenarios on the national and international scene. Following AIRS will help you stay on the top of not only current affairs and get an in-depth analysis of burning topics, it will also give you the opportunity to expand your knowledge base through the diversity of our events. We now also have publication opportunities with Millennium Journal of Humanities and Social Sciences. You can submit your papers to the official mail, which is aribamuazzam@airscholars on Microsoft.com. The mail will be on our chat box for accuracy. You can follow AIRS on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WhatsApp, Telegram. You can also follow our site, airs.org.in. Thank you, and over to you, Ariba.
Thank you, Ivan, for that succinct introduction of AIRS. Now let me invite Zeba Tamkana, the Vice President of AIRS, to introduce the eminent speaker. Over to you, Zeba.
Thank you so much, Ariba. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let me introduce Professor Arun Patnaik. Professor Arun Patnaik is the Dean of the School of Social Sciences, University of Hyderabad. He has also been the former HOD from the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad. His areas of interest are political thought, Gramsci's Marxism, democratic thought in India, political economy of development of India, and India's secularism. He has done his education from JNU, including his master's, MPhil, and PhD. He has been a visiting professor at the Uppsala University, Sweden in May 2006 and at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla in June 2009. He has around 18 publications in various journals, including national and international ones, like EPW, the Political Scientist, and Journal of Polity and Society. He has taken on many research projects in his dynamic career, including titled Gramsci and Luxembourg on Human Rights, a PG diploma program of human rights edited by Center for Distance Education, University of Hyderabad in 2002. Thank you. Over to you, Ariba.
Thank you, Zeba. I now invite Professor Arun Kumar Patnaik, sir, to share with us some of the most significant arguments in Gramsci's political thought. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Ariva, and thank you, Association for Indian Research Scholars, for inviting me to share some ideas on Gramsci. As you know, Gramsci is one of my favorite philosophers, and I have been not merely working with him, but also I use his ideas to understand crisis of secularism in India, crisis of social movements in India, especially left movement in India. So, in the nature of Communist Party in India. So, I use various concepts of Gramsci to understand the political processes in India. But I'm essentially a theory person rather than a person of Indian politics. But being with Gramsci, you can't be purely theoretical. There's a very nature of his inquiry, and he would insist that should be grounded in history. Therefore, my focus is my history and my history, Indian history. Therefore, I try to examine some problems in India's history and how Gramsci could be applied. And I have a book coming up from Routledge. There's a title as Common Sense, Religion and Political Society, Gramsci in South Asia. How Gramsci has traveled in various parts of South Asia, Pakistan, Nepal, India, and even some African cases I have cited. So it's important to make sense of Gramsci by connecting with your history. That is the most important point you want to learn from Gramsci. Gramsci tried to develop new ideas by contesting received histories. He never accepted received theories, received ideas. He challenged them, he negotiated with them, accepted partly, modified partly, rejected partly, and offered alternatives based on his understanding of his country. And that is the lesson one learns from Gramsci. That's therefore is to be with your history. That's the most important lesson you learn from Gramsci. And second reason why you should be interested in Gramsci today is that he's one of those rare thinkers in the Marxist camp with whom one can have a dialogue. Nobody else, generally left intellectuals are anti-dialogue. You just can't have dialogue with them. They just put you off. They put arguments in such a perfectionist manner that there is no room for debate and discussion with them. They simply say, we are right and if you don't agree with us, you are wrong. Gramsci opens up new windows and says, nothing is perfect. It's like Aristotle. He's a typical Aristotelian thinker from the left. Aristotle was for the right, but Gramsci uses Aristotle very effectively from the left and argues in prison notebooks that we must try to synthesize all the time because the world is full of binaries, full of conflicting views, full of polarized viewpoints. So it is important for us to develop a synthesis, but remember one thing, no way your synthesis is complete at any point of time. This is the important lesson we learn from Ramsey is that you must aim at synthesis and whatever synthesis you offer, don't fall in love with it. It is important for you to stay alive to see that your synthesis remains incomplete in light of new historical point, new historical discoveries. Therefore, be always open-ended to history. So learn from history, learn from everybody. And there are four important points he says one must learn. Before I give his salient contributions, I like to say overall picture of Gramsci. He is a learner. He's not educated. He disarms himself. He presents himself in a way you feel that he's continuously learning from all of us. He's with us. The way he talks to us, the way he tries to theorize. You feel he's with us all the time, and especially I feel that he's with me all the time. And the reason why I say is simple. Gramsci said that Marxism. He was a deeply communist thinker, and he was committed to Marxism. Many communists branded him as anti-communist. Many communists branded him as a Catholic. When he died, he was buried in Catholic church, grave cemetery, and by his sister-in-law. And many comrades thought that since he was critical of Soviet Marxism, therefore he turned Catholic at the time of death. That is far from truth. Gramsci remained atheist and remained committed to Marxism throughout life, and remained critical of orthodoxies in Marxism as he saw it shaping in Soviet Union during his time. That's the important point. That he remained critical of Communist International Marxism that came from Moscow, and he was not willing to the line. It was very clear and wrote several letters criticizing the expulsion, dismissal, killing of comrades who fought for Russian revolution. And if those letters reached Moscow, he would have been probably suspended or killed in jail itself. Fortunately, the letters were suppressed by his friend who became chairman of the Italian Communist Party. So, but the three important lessons to learn from Gramsci, let me say it. One is, you must learn from the strength of your enemies. If you don't learn from strength of enemies, you will not grow as an intellectual. This is the first important lesson you will learn from Gramsci. Second, you must learn from the strength of common people, ordinary people. The ordinary people also philosophers. Ordinary people also intellectuals. They are non-technical intellectuals. They may not be technical intellectuals. They may not satisfy your technical format of thinking loud, thinking rational format. Yet there is rationalism in them. There is wisdom in them. There are potential rational thinking in them. There are many good senses in them. There are many prejudicial thinking in them. Therefore, bundle of contradiction in them. But nevertheless, learn from the strength. The strength is good sense, which is not with intellectuals of the world. He says to be intellectual of the world, learn from ordinary and observe them in your thinking, synthesize them, combine them with historical wisdom. That's a fundamental contribution of Antonio Gramsci. Nobody else has said that so clearly as Gramsci, from the left as well as the liberal. For me, Gramsci remains singularly interesting here. He says that the first order of historical thinking is the lesson you learn from the ordinary. Ordinary wisdom is very important for you. If you can't learn from lessons from that, the first order of historical reason has gone out of your window. You may be high historian of high philosopher of history, but you don't know the grassroots historical knowledge. Therefore, to be with history is to be first with ordinary people's history. First and foremost, if you miss out this point, the starting point of history is actually learning from good sense of the ordinary people, the good common sense of ordinary people. Common sense is conflicting views, but it is necessary for you to learn from the positive part of it. That's second. Third point is it's important for you to learn from friends who are not with you. Everybody is not with you. Your friends may be with you and they may have different points of view. Your friends are different from you. Therefore, for you as a collective, as an individual, you must learn from your friends who may be partly with you, partly not with you. But are you learning from them? Therefore, these are three important lessons you learn from Gramsci, and partly they're in Lenin. I won't be able to say in detail. Lenin makes this argument that Marxism, 20th century, to be alive, must learn from the strength of enemies. This point actually comes from Lenin, and Gramsci offers a philosophical outlook to that. Lenin uses a strategical reason. He said Marxism should be theoretically sound to learn from the strength of the enemies. For him, the positivism was the enemy, and therefore, to be critical of positivism is not to dismiss it off. Try to learn strength of positivism while oppose positivism. Lenin was critical of positivism, but yet he said, "Don't be critical, overly critical." The strength of positivism is to develop a scientific understanding of world, systematic, logical understanding of the world. Therefore, they offered many new techniques of understanding world, new techniques of data collection, new way of looking at doing research of the world. Therefore, this is an important empirical research discovered by positivist research. Today, the whole world of universities are guided by positivistic empirical research. And all empirical research you do, for all quantitative research, credit goes to positivism. Without positivism, you cannot have thought of quantitative research, sampling, sensors, nothing you could have done without positivism. But that's a strength of positivism. So the Lenin says, don't dismiss it off. Say that quantitative research is bogus, fraud, and only you should focus on qualitative research, and that's all nonsense. Learn from strength of the enemy. That's an important lesson Gramsci adopts for Marxism. So three important lessons he has outlined, and sadly, communist parties across the world never learn from themselves. So there's no way they could learn from friends or even enemies. They stopped learning from themselves. Their experience was useful for them to learn. If they had learned from their own experience, they would not have been in such a pathetic position today. They would be far better if they had been alive to their own experience, historically enacted by their own comrades from time to time, different periods of history in India as well as the world. But that is not so with our comrades. Comrades are full of binary conflicts, full of fraternal wars, and full of sectarian beliefs. And they romanticize activism, they romanticize everybody. They don't romanticize people as well. That's not the critical thinking comrades are supposed to have. And they have become very uncritical of themselves and overly critical of enemies and friends and their own comrades who have a dissenting voice. The result, communist movement has gone down the drain. The left movement has gone down the drain. Not only communist, even the Ambedkarite left as well as the feminist left have gone down the drain. I don't want to say, since you are from Hyderabad, very well you know me, that two feminists of Hyderabad can't see eye to eye with each other. There's a sad state of affairs in the city of Hyderabad, and I've been critical of them for last 30 years, but they don't listen to anybody. They know that I'm alive, I'm critical of them. They don't even invite me to speak to them. That's a different point. But I'm not critical of feminism, I'm critical of their narrow-mindedness. And there's something they must learn from Gramsci. I've been insisting for the last 30 years, but they don't listen to any one of us. They set up, but you would be surprised. The RSS wanted to learn from Gramsci. I propose same thing to CPM and the feminists of the city. They refuse to learn. Once this Baravara group invited me to speak on Gramsci, and they said Gramsci is not relevant for us. So fine, thank you. I said, and I came back. So at least they listened to me once to say that Gramsci is no more relevant for them. So that's why Gramsci is important for, because Gramsci is important because is to raise your antenna, to raise your knowledge bar. You have to remain open-ended. Second, you must learn from three things: learn from the ordinary, learn from friends, learn from enemies. Their strength, not their weaknesses. Weakness, you overcome weakness, but you can't overcome weakness unless you learn their strength, absorb their strength, and with their strength in you, you will grow. That's the important, the simple, commonsensical point. Gramsci's entire philosophical outreach is all about this. I will tell you now in detail how Gramsci. I will not tell you Gramsci's biography because I generally get very emotional. I may lose my control if I talk about his biography. His biography, very oppressive biography. He went through torture and a lot of humiliation, jail, etc. And it generally makes me very emotional. I will avoid talking about it. I spoke to my class this time. I practically broke down. So I will avoid breaking down here because people are watching. Let me say briefly about Gramsci's contribution. See, Gramsci's contributions can be seen in many forms. One important contribution, an intellectual contribution, is this. Gramsci argued that both liberals and the socialists, and let me say briefly, Gramsci was born in 1897 and he died in 1891 and died in 1937. So he lived for 46 years and died in the prison. He lived in prison for 11 years. He was sentenced for 12 years. At the end of the prison term, he died. And he went through a lot of physical torture throughout his childhood experience. Etc. I will not do. And the 1891 is remarkable for us, for India, because in 1891, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was born. Therefore, there is an interesting synergy. I will come back to it. Say there are these two great philosophers. There is tremendous similarity between them. I will, as I examine fascism, examine democracy, you find tremendous similarity between them. I will get back to, as I speak on Gramsci, I will sprinkle with Ambedkar's ideas. You will understand the significance of Gramsci and Ambedkar comparison there. The first point Gramsci says that is important for the socialists to learn from the liberals. He says liberal are our enemy, but this is the important point. Everywhere he talks like that. It's important for first point. He says this first point socialists must learn from liberal is to appreciate autonomy of individuals. Just if you don't appreciate autonomy of individuals, you will not grow. Your socialism will not grow. It will be ungrounded. It will be disembodied. It will not connect with individual liberty, individual conscience. Individual is always seeking his or her freedom. If you don't identify autonomy of individual in search for freedom, search for equality or dignity, you will not be able to connect with individuals' intellectual search, and you will disconnect from it. Therefore, his first point is the first important says first reform. Socialists must bring about is to reform their concept of man. He uses the concept of man because you know that 1930s language was only men. Women were not part of the linguistic dribbling. Let us drop men and use human being. Says if to understand human being, you must understand individuality of each human being. First point. Then he says second. He tells the liberals. So liberals are obsessed with only individuality, and the socialists are obsessed with collectivity. This obsession is to be overcome. The liberals must learn from socialists that individuality is important, yes, but individual exists in connection with many collectives, multiple collectives. There are two important collectives. One, individuals are connected with the society, social collectives, which are again many, but society is important, larger collective. Second thing is individuals are connected with nature, and through collective, individuals double with nature. They improvise, they connect, they stay alive, and they modify their life, and they continuously assert the autonomy vis-a-vis nature. There is conflict and there is harmony with nature. Therefore, he says overall, it's important for both the liberals to revise their view of human being and socialists to revise their view of human being. The concept of human being must be revised by both. And is actually a point made by Aristotle. Gramsci refers in the prison notebooks that neither socialists nor liberals have learned anything from Aristotle. He makes a very drastic argument. He says, Aristotle makes a simple argument. Aristotle says, human being is a social, rational, and political animal. Animal, animal, remember, mark the word. Animal that must be socialized, rationalized, and politicized. Therefore, this is important. He says, we keep citing this as a mantra, but how many of us drawn inferences from this mantra? None. There is no study of by a liberal or by a Marxist or by a socialist to examine what does Aristotle mean by saying these three things: sociality, rationality, and politicization of political nature of human being. We have not drawn inferences from it. Therefore, it is important for us to examine under what condition of society that we stay and must build, where human being can be imparted rationality, where human being is animal, the animal called human being must be imparted sense of rationality, sense of sociality, and sense of politics. The human beings, this is to be debated, and we are simply oblivious of this question, and therefore we don't even debate. Since the question Aristotle raised, and the question was posed by Hobbes as well, Hobbes in the first paragraph in Leviathan says that let us make man. Otherwise, man is not man. Huh? Man is remains animal. Remember, that's the implication. Now, therefore, let us make this man a man. Without, if you don't make this man a man, this man will remain brute force, brute animal. Brutality will take place. State of nature will be alive, or the society will collapse. Unless we build society institutions in a way, man can be socialized, man can be replaced by human being can be socialized, rationalized, and politicized. There will be doomsday for us. There will be brute force of power, brutality of animality. Animal dance will take place in form of sociality and liberty and equality, which happened already. Name of liberty equality. How many people who have butchered? How many people who have killed? How many civilizations are buried? How many civilizations are destroyed by civilizing missions of various countries, of various communities, of various cultures? Not simply West against us, even within us. How many civilizing missionaries are there in India trying to destroy each other? It's important for us to see that. Therefore, Gramsci's argument that both liberals and socialists must reform their concept of human being. And 3 points are there. So each individuality is reflected in various elements. Individuality reflected each individual. Individual reflected in relation to other men, other human beings, larger society, and individuality reflected in connection with the natural world. The three important layers of connections are important to establish. Therefore, search for individuality is the primacy of political project. That's the important first point. And it has many aspects. It gives a simple example. It says, take for example Marx and Engels. They are not one and same. Socialists have constructed a mythical idea that Marx and Engels are one and same. They are not. They are two different individuals who contributed together to the project of communism. But you examine them deeply, you will find Engels was more open-ended in certain matters connected with the natural world, etc. Engels was more open-ended. Engels was more open-ended with regard to sexuality question. Engels was more open-ended with women question. Marx was very conservative in these areas, and same time Marx was more progressive with regard to criticism of positivism. Engels was slightly imitating of positivism. Marx was open-ended to understanding of history. Marx was open-ended to understanding of politics. Both Engels and Marx were open-ended to autonomy of politics. Therefore, there are similarities and differences. Marx was progressive in some matters, Engels was conservative, and Engels was progressive in some matters, Marx was conservative. Therefore, to say that Marx and Engels are progressive and left, all nonsense. Just doesn't make sense. But point is, that is the nature of individuals contribute to a project quite differently. They come together when they see similarities among themselves, but yet their similarities apart, they differ from each other. Marx disagreed with Engels several times on the issue of family. The book and Marx children painted as if there is a great harmony. That's not true. There's a lot of difference of opinion between the two of them. And yet Engels was liberal. He was kind enough, and he contributed money. Marx lived, as you know, lived by his parcels, his financial parcels saved Marx and the family. For that difference apart, there is great synergy between them. Therefore, it is important for you to understand the differences and similarities in a social collective. Any social collective is important to respect differences. Marx respected Engels' differences. Engels was more open-ended about Marx' positions, and he never quarreled with him on his with regard to his disagreement. Therefore, that's openness is important to build a social collective, and that indicates that Marx and Engels are not one and same. Therefore, individuality is an important task of the socialist project. Socialists must incorporate the individuality of individual in contributing to a collective thinking. Otherwise, socialism must be willing to appreciate, difference of opinion, and it is through creative difference of opinion is possible to enhance the socialist thinking. That is important lesson one has learned from liberals and also Catholic Church. Gramsci says that is Catholic Church possesses the idea of individual very strongly, though in a traditional format. But the idea of individual must be savior of himself. Individual must seek mercy of the God. Individual must do good things for society so that God will be kind to him. They or her. These are all sticks of individualism in Catholic, in the medieval era, Catholic Church promoted individualism, of what Gramsci calls religious individualism. It's an interesting concept he has developed. Therefore, it's important for you to learn from religious individualism of Catholic Church. Important for you to learn from liberal individualism of modern intellectuals, modern bourgeois society. And there are, therefore, each of these ideologies have a tremendous strength in appreciating individuals' contributions, individual achievement. Therefore, it is important for it us to reinvigorate the socialist project. So Gramsci remained from day one a reformer of socialism. Though he was the founder of the Communist Party, he remained critical of his communism from day one, an internal critic of communism from day one. Second formulation I would say submit is that for Gramsci, that society must be seen as a multi-layer unit. A social collective cannot be simply seen as a homogeneous entity controlled by classes and and class power. This is what usually socialism argues, Marxism especially argues. And while that is true, Ramsey argues that class relations control society in a diverse form. Sometimes they deploy coercion, sometimes they manufacture consent. Therefore, he says the society, as a result of this duality of power, on the one hand use brute power, on the other hand use consent making processes. Power gets normalized, a term used by Foucault next century, maybe after the World War II. You therefore find complexities in social institutions. I'm saying that every time you examine society in ancient time or modern time or medieval time, you find three layers of society. One is the economic connection with the nature, where you deal with natural phenomena. You interact with nature through economic setup. Economy essentially is a act of, indicates act of production. So you deal with productive, you produce productive forces. You create autonomous space for yourself in the world of nature, and it is through that world you interact with nature. Therefore, the level of productive force basically means you socialize nature. Socialize nature by use of science, technology, rationality, and institutions, factories, agriculture, and business, etc. You are essentially trying to create a space for your survival. That's that is Gramsci says that that's actually what Marx calls productive force. Gramsci calls it socialization of nature. So that is the first layer of society. Society, all societies have this foundation. The productive forces provide the first foundation on which the other social layers are built. Without this, you don't have society. Without this, you don't have civilization. Therefore, this is the first primary form of history. Therefore, society is built on the basis of the way we deal with nature, the way we socialize nature. No societies have been built without it. You can't think of a society where human beings don't deal with nature. It's just possible. Therefore, we build families, we stay away from nature, we build safety for ourselves, again stay away from nature. Therefore, we remain in nature out of it. Therefore, we try to build a kind of dialectic with nature. The dialectic produces a sphere called socialization of nature, where nature is mastered, socialized, and a friendly relationship established, yet we are independent of nature. We are partly social. Therefore, the animal now becomes social. Moment the animal becomes social, there is an inference you learn from Aristotle. Moment animal becomes social, you have society. Otherwise, other rest of the animals don't become. They have some sociality, but the social fabric is not so developed, expanded, and they don't have independence. We have independence. We don't simply live in the lap of nature. All other animals simply live in the lap of nature. We don't. There's a single important difference between us and them. Therefore, nobody romanticizing animals. Animals they have some sense of sociality. I agree, but sociality doesn't give them. It only gives them a cradle. It doesn't give them a complex set of institutions where where the animals become independent of nature. We have become, we had become, we have become, we will be. Therefore, that's the story of history. History is essentially created by act of production by human beings. That's the first phase of history. And second, that's the economic form. Then his second form, he says, all societies have civil societies. All. And here again, a misconception. Most of the Marxists and socialists think that civil society is a modern phenomenon. That's not true. Please read Aristotle. Civil society is ancient society as well. And Marx and Engels say clearly in German ideology that civil society have been existing for ancient times. And family, associations, village communities, urban councils, urban societies, they've been staying with us from ancient times onwards. We are not because the same institutions operate in modern times. Don't you have family? So the same family institution was born in ancient period when first act of civilization produced families. Therefore, all these institutions which have been trying to socialize human beings, trying to inject a sense of politics to human life, trying to impart sense of rationality to us, so that we don't act as a brute force with animal power. We try to control ourselves and mediate, restrain ourselves in social behavior, in our dealing with each other, so that we remain friendly towards each other. The question of friendship was posed by Aristotle, Hobbes, and Gramsci. So, therefore, from ancient till modern time, everybody worried about how to build a society which will nurture friendship, which nurture social connection. Therefore, this Gramsci says that this produces civil society. Once we are trying to advance human life, human society through multiple connections to sustain your dealing with nature, you interact while dealing with interactive nature. We sustain. Therefore, we produce civil society. Civil society is a very ancient institution. However, the modern society, bourgeois society, is also a modern civil society. So, civil society has history, just as economic socialization nature has also history. So, also civil society history. Everything is historical, and civil society, neither our economic interaction with nature has remained constant, nor our interaction with each other has remained constant. We have kept on revising our history, adopting course corrections. We had in ancient period we maintained slavery in Europe, and in India we maintain caste system, atrocious caste system. And but in modern period we are trying to challenge it, we are trying to overcome it, and we have many ways we have overcome caste system, and we are still challenging it. And in the European history, they have given up slavery. They have gone ahead with feudalism and modern capitalism, which has completely destroyed slavery, especially Europe, not in US, if not in US. US capitalism revived slavery as a complex history, but I will not get into that. Question is, we need civil society in order to offer what Aristotle calls socialization of human nature. To deepen socialize human nature, it is not enough to socialize nature. You must socialize yourself, socializing human life, not simply socializing nature. That is very important. It's foundational form of society. That by having simply a foundation, you don't have a house, na. It's like having a house with a foundation. With no house, you can't have a house with simply a foundation. You have to build a house on the basis of the foundation. Civil society provides the first layer of the house. Without civil society, you don't have the beginning of a house, a only foundation. With simply economic foundation, you don't have society, you don't have a house. That's the metaphor he uses. Therefore, his house has two layers. One, the base is civil society. At the top, you have state. The house consists of kind of a two-storied kind of house with civil society on the ground floor and state on the top floor. And the the economic base remains the foundation. Therefore, a house has three layers in a way. House of society has three layers. As I said, it's a multi-layer society, multi-layer structure. Economic foundation, the foundation that belongs to part nature and part society, and on the basis of that, civil society and state are created. The superstructure has two aspects. Superstructure has two. One is the base of superstructure is civil society, and base of that within superstructure you have a split, you have separation of civil society and the state. So therefore, it says if you see societies from ancient till modern time, you are likely to witness these three layers. All society three layers. Unfortunately, Marxists have not understood this. They've gone overboard. They say only civil society is modern society. All medieval society, ancient period, no civil society. Actually, a historical understanding of society. That's because the original question of Aristotle is very important. They don't understand Aristotle. Therefore, they think that nobody is worried about building society. Every thinker is worried about building society. Aristotle asked, that's why the first point is that you must please understand Aristotle better. You understand Aristotle better, you'll understand many complexities better. And therefore, Gramsci said that this one important innovation of Gramsci is that civil society mediates between the socialization of nature that regulated by class society and and the political framework of running society, governing society, that is managed by the state. The civil society mediates between state and classes. Classes that control nature on the one hand, and state that controls society. So civil society mediates between these two institutions, and for Gramsci, civil society is an independent sphere. It doesn't belong to state. Now it belongs to economy, but it belongs to superstructure. But within superstructure, it is a base. Without it, you don't have state. Because state depends on civil society to run its functions. And these are one of the most original. I told you same, but this is the most original contribution of Gramsci. Gramsci offers a very complex idea. If I speak on civil society, I will be lost. And I will be teaching right now to my students for last 3 weeks. So it will be difficult for you to digest. I have to run through this. If the questions answer, we'll come back to it. But remember, civil society is a sphere where I will make an interesting point. I leave here. The sphere where most of the struggles take place. The struggles in class relations manifest in civil society. The struggles over political power manifest in civil society. So most of the struggles take place in the sphere of civil society. Most of the conflicts take place in the sphere of civil society. Most of the, and Majini says, family is the first form of politicization of citizenship. Family that teaches you the elementary values of citizenship, civic virtues of citizenship. You must not walk on the left side or right side. Who teaches you first? Not school teachers, huh? Parents. Parents in India would teach you that you must walk on the left side. Huh? Don't look at, don't walk on the right side. And Pakistani parents will teach you that walk on the right side. This the point is, this lesson is taught to us. Civic virtues of citizenship is taught to us by our parents, by family. Even illiterate parents give the basic training, and educated parents do the same thing. Therefore, the question is therefore, the civil society is the first school of training, the first baby, first cradle of citizenship. Majini says, family is the cradle of citizenship. Without family, you cannot think of citizenship building. It's not possible. The civic virtues of citizenship are taught to us by our parents. Then we learn political virtues, we learn economic virtues, we learn cultural virtues, partly from family, if they are educated well off, and partly from education, from religious organizations, from larger society. But without family, the basic foundations of citizenship can never be nurtured. It's not, just as I said, without economic foundations, you don't have socialized nature. No society is possible to imagine. Similarly, without family, you can't think of civic virtues of citizenship. The family, as Majini argues, remains the cradle of citizenship. Like that, civil society performs basic training functions, and these training functions have been performed from ancient till modern time. The idea of citizenship kept on changing, revised historical times. It did not remain same. Many men and women are denied citizenship ancient period. Now we have universal citizenship, yet universal citizenship formally available to us, informally denied to us. Therefore, there are again contests take place around this. Therefore, civil society is zone of contest. Civil society is zone where subalterns raise their voice. Civil society is zone where power tries to normalize your voices. Civil society for Gramsci is therefore hegemonic and also counter-hegemonic. Is a absolutely elegant thing. Is a path-breaking innovation here. Nobody thought of civil society. Not even Gramscian scholars understand this. I will not be able to tell you this, but many Gramscian scholars think that civil society is essentially a society that is hegemonic. That's not true. That is partly true. The dominant structure of civil society under dominant condition of capitalism is hegemonic, but that is not the entire story of civil society. The entire story of civil society is a story of conflict, story of opposition, story of challenge, story of contestation. Subalterns are marginalized by civil society, and their life is normalized by power relationship. Yet, they have not lost their voices. They raise their voices. They challenge their marginalization. They question it. They say that, okay, formal equality is given to us, but we are informally denied of it. So therefore, they question the informal denial of equality, and they question the accessibility of equal opportunity. They question the voices of people. Amartya Sen has been arguing for a long time. Equality, equal opportunity is available, but equal opportunity not accessible. That voice is not simply Amartya Sen's voice. The voice comes from ordinary people. Talk to ordinary people will tell you. Gramsci would say, you talk to ordinary people, you will say, you will show Amartya Sen there. They would try to discover that Amartya Sen in ordinary voices. Huh? That's the task of a Gramscian intellectual. That's why Gramsci is so interesting and very enlightening. Therefore, it is therefore Gramsci civil society is as a zone of contestation. On the one hand, is very powerful hegemonic forces try to control them through factory organization, through pressure groups, through various clubs, etc. Control, normalization of relations take place, and subalterns tend to be marginalized in the sphere, despite having universal equality, etc. Universality of certain rights. They are not accessible to a large number of people, and those people again raise their voice to challenge it. Therefore, civil society, therefore, is a zone of contestation. They reflect the contradiction in economic sphere, they reflect contradiction in political sphere, and they put pressure on the political sphere, state power. State power continuously keeps on changing its structure, negotiation, etc. Therefore, civil society, in Gramsci's innovative theory, is a zone of contestation. It is not simply a zone of hegemony, not simply a zone of counter-hegemony, it is both. Therefore, this is the duality of civil society, is one of the innovation of Antonio Gramsci. Even Gramscian scholars have missed this duality. They argue that civil society is purely hegemonic. I don't know how Gramscian scholars misunderstand Gramsci. That remains a mystery for me. Partha Chatterjee argues that civil society is a hegemonic society. That is a misconstruction of Gramsci. I give one example. I can give hundreds of examples of Europe where there is a misconstruction of Gramsci go on. In the name of this, how socialist movement has drained its energy. It got misdirected. Anyway, that's a different point. But then the Gramsci argues that. Therefore, he says, if you look at the history of civil society, it's important for you to examine that various kinds of subalterns exist. Women are part of one subalternity. They experience marginalized. They experience marginalized. They experience marginalization of different kinds across class. That's one. Similarly, poor, they experience one kind of marginalization that is class specific, and similarly, black people also experience marginalization across class, across economic divisions, and similarly, Gramsci talks about caste as well. This is backward caste in India. Now, prison notebooks are the new notebooks are there. He talks about backward classes in India also experience marginalization, and European ruling classes acting like upper caste of India. He says one passage. European ruling classes acting like upper caste of India, trying to marginalize everybody. Like the interesting point he makes. And says European classes are not like classes; they're actually like castes of India. By dealing with India, they adopted Indian structures in Europe. So the colonial power has learned wrong things from India by borrowing our caste system to Europe. A point made by Rammohn Loya 50 years later. Gramsci anticipates Loya here. It's a very interesting synergies between Gramsci, Loya, Gramsci, Ambedkar, etc. So therefore, says Gramsci argues that socialists must defend the experience of subalterns and try to reclaim the space in civil society for them. Reclaim civil society for subalterns. Don't try to destroy civil society. Don't try to abolish civil society, as socialists try to argue. He says, don't, if you do it, then there is a brute force of human beings. You have not learned lesson from Aristotle. Aristotle tried to precisely overcome this problem. He must create society so that human beings remain social, political, and rational animal. If you destroy civil society, you say civil society must wither away along with classes and castes. Caste must go, classes must go, fine. But if you destroy civil society, then you destroy everything else. And what remains? Remains animality. Therefore, you miss out Aristotle's original question. Under what condition human being called animal must be made social? That question will remain unaddressed. That's why Aristotle is a deeply Aristotle thing. He goes back to Aristotle again and again in such of questions he poses to socialists and liberals. He simply dismantles socialist and liberal thinking across the world. Therefore, Gramsci, in my view, is a very stimulating thinker, very original, interesting thinker. So, therefore, the many lessons you learn from civil society, I will not able to go further on that. How much time I have? I am losing track of time.
So you have around 10 minutes more.
Okay, let me quickly sum up this. Then he says there are two important points Gramsci makes. I will stay with that and close my lesson here. There are three more important points. I will not examine them. I will examine two more points. One, Gramsci says that that the educator must be educated. As we try to reform society, as we try to transform society, we need a program of education. Without a program of education, because Gramsci says that civil society, say, look at the nature of power. Power relationship in modern form, try to educate us, try to normalize us, so that we accept that our fate is with us. This is our fate to be so. Therefore, we accept that this is our destiny, this is my karma, this is my fate, and we don't question the power relationship. This process is obtained through process of education, not through coercion. Similarly, the task of socialism is to question that. To question that, you must also use the program of education. You cannot do something else to dismantle normalizing function of power that controls subaltern life. Therefore, to be with socialism is to be with subaltern, is to be with the education program. Therefore, it is necessary for socialists to invent a new form of education program, an alternative form of education program, and to be educating people is to learn from them. You cannot educate people without learning from people. Gramsci said, therefore, educator must be educated. There's a point made by Karl Marx in the fourth thesis of the thesis of Feuerbach. Marx makes this point. The educator must be educated. Gramsci invokes this idea differently. Marx was referring to himself while he thought that he must educate the educator. When he was saying educator must be educated, he was meaning educator must be educated by him. But Gramsci makes a spin there. He says educator must be educated by Marx, fine, but they are educated by ordinary people. This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant point made by Gramsci. He says, therefore, it is important for an educator to learn from people. Otherwise, he says, educators, he's very critical of caste system. I told you, European classes, he makes this point. He says, if the intellectual class doesn't learn from ordinary people, they will be like upper caste of India. Gramsci makes it interesting. He said they will like Neo Brahmins. Whether European Neo Brahmins or Indian Neo Brahmins, they remain white Brahmins or brown Brahmins or black Brahmins like me. But the point is, they must be educated. If they are not, then they are like caste. That must be outcast, must be dismantled. Gramsci is ruthless in that. So the first task is to learn from ordinary. Point I made in the beginning. First, learn from the ordinary. They will give you the, because if you look at the ordinary people, I've written a full length essay on this. Gramsci's concept of common sense in Economic Political Weekly in 1988. Actually, that's how that was my first academic paper in my entire intellectual career. That is my beginning of my intellectual life. I must read that essay in EPW. I will not examine that detail. Gramsci says that you look at ordinary people's common sense, you will find contradictions. There is prejudicial sense, there is good sense. Good senses are many, and prejudices are many, and negative, prejudicial, reactionary, superstitious beliefs, there are many. But beneath that mud of many negative sense, you are likely to find lily flower of good sense. A metaphor used by Kosambi. So in the mud of history, Kosambi says, it's possible for genuine leftists discover lily flowers. So in the mud of common sense, I would repeat Kosambi. In the mud of common sense, it's possible for socialists to discover a good sense. Good sense is not one, many. Beneath many layers of prejudicial, hateful, vengeful attitudes which are disseminated among ordinary people. They also nurture, they also believe in that. It is possible, it is necessary and possible for us to discover the good senses which they nurture. These good senses, why they live in society. They live in society with good senses, and they live against each other with bad senses. Therefore, the fact that they live and live against, they live within themselves, live against others, that indicates that there are many good senses in their life. Without that, they cannot live with themselves. Therefore, it is important for socialists to uncover that, learn from that, and develop it further. Because it says Marxism remains a philosophy of good sense. If it is to remain, if it is to remain a philosophy of good sense, it must nurture, it must learn from good senses of ordinary people. So educator must be educated, and without that, they will lose grip of ordinary people, and they will lose touch with the historical reasoning. That's the important thing. Now, in process of that, in process of education, second last point I would like to say is that you must also try to develop intellectuals from among the ordinary people. The task of hegemony, if you seek a civil society, the hegemony function of civil society is to see that subalterns remain subalterns by de-intellectualizing them. Therefore, task of counter-hegemony or resistance or the emancipation is to liberate them from these de-intellectualizing processes, to developing intellectuals from among themselves. Unless women become intellectuals, they will not know what is subordinity. Unless Dalits become intellectuals, they will not know what is caste question. Unless workers become intellectuals, they will not know what is capitalism. Unless peasants become intellectuals, they will not know what is feudalism, what is landlordism. Therefore, task of emancipation is to liberate subalterns from subalternity, from marginalization, by developing intellectuals from within them. Unless they become intellectuals, what Gramsci was organic intellectuals, representing subalternity, representing marginalization, fighting against it, socialist movement will not gain stability. Yes, the task of hegemony is to de-intellectualize them, and if socialism also contributes to de-intellectualizing them, then it is gone. Project is gone, is misdirected. I will end with a story. Once Agopal myself went with Agopal myself, Kanaviran, Balgopal. All of us went together to inaugurate human rights forum, human rights unit in Angul district. A district unit was being inaugurated. And that was in 1995. And we went, a lot of speeches happened, and quite a few 30 rickshaw pullers came to discuss with Hargopal. And we separated out, and they had chat with him. They said, they told him, Then chatting with him, I was a bit surprised about the questions they were putting to Hargopal. I asked them, who taught you all these questions? They were asking questions, what is the future of socialism in China? What is the future of socialism in Cuba? What is the future of socialism in Vietnam? Why socialism collapsed in Soviet Union? Why it collapsed in Eastern Europe? They were asking these questions. So I thought, yeah, many professors don't ask these questions. How these fellows know all these questions? I was surprised. Then I asked them, how do you know all these things? Then says, our comrades, we are part of CPM. We go to Sunday meeting of CPM office and Eka Gopal Center. In Eka Gopal Center, comrades read Prajasakti, the CPM newspaper. When they read Prajasakti, they translate some of those ideas to us. Then I said, how long it goes on? So it is going on for last 30 years, sir. Then I asked them, didn't you have urge to read Prajasakti on your own? They gave a very fantastic reply. And that is remember that I last 30 years back, I had this story. The story remains in my mind. I said, so when they will be finding timing to teach us, they're so busy in fighting against themselves. They're engaging war with each other. They have no time for us. They're never bothered to teach us that we must learn Telugu to read Prajasakti on our own, to become intellectuals on our own. Therefore, therefore, we experience marginality with our comrades. The question is, they are our comrades after all. Point, look at this. Here the wisdom. Here the typical Gramscian voice coming from a rickshaw puller. They drive rickshaws of Eka Gopal Center, and they drive rickshaws in Angul town. Cycle rickshaw. The rickshawalas are talking like Gramsci. I saw this wisdom of Gramsci in the ordinary voices of Angul town. That day I thought Gramsci comes alive. This is where Gramsci comes always alive. Talk to ordinary people, you will see, discover voices of Gramsci in them. And therefore, that's the point one learns from Anglo experience is that unless you develop rickshawalas as intellectuals, the left movement will not gain stability. It will remain unstable. It will be caught with internal wars. It will be caught in a messy situation. It will not be human. It will be very anti-humanistic in a many forms. And the forces you are trying to liberate, you are suppressing them. You are marginalizing them. You are trying to liberate rickshawalas from domination of capital. Yet you are contributing to marginalization by de-intellectualizing them as well. Therefore, how are you different from hegemonic processes? That's the question Gramsci asked during his time. And that's why they called him revisionist, they called him renegade, they called him cynical, all kinds of nonsense. They also, sometimes they call me cynical. So all the activists call me cynical. But I'm not so cynical. I'm cynical of them. I'm not cynical of ordinary people. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. It was such an enlightening lecture. I just have no words. I feel like I have been transported to my MA days where I've learned so much from you in your classes on Aristotle and Gramsci. This lecture was equally memorable. Thank you once again for this beautiful lecture. I've learned so much from it, especially about civil society and the small anecdotes that you have said. It was wonderful. So thank you so much for this. Now I have a few questions that our participants would like to ask. I'll read them one by one and you'll have to, I think, respond to them. The first question is by Tem Jain Dongla Imsong. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. So he would like to know, can you please kindly enlighten more on Gramsci's concept of hegemony? Also suggest some readings on this, is what he is asking.
Okay. See, best thing is you read original Gramsci. I mean, read the present notebooks. There's a part in present notebook that is civil society and state. Read that part. There are chapters on hegemony. Read that. That is one. Second, to read, if you want to know a textbook, you must read Roger Simon's work on Gramsci's Marxism in introduction. There is a chapter on hegemony that is very beautifully written and very well summed up. And they also paper written by Shweta Kaviraj, who introduced us to Gramsci in JNU. And I'm trying to get a copy of that paper that is published in Teaching Politics, New Delhi, when we were students of JNU. The paper is titled as Subtler Sides of Domination. If you can, it's difficult because Teaching Politics is discontinued now. It's very difficult to get. I'm trying to get a copy from Kaviraj. Kaviraj said, yesterday I called him and I need that paper for my student. I'm teaching them that actually. This semester I need that paper because students find difficulty reading in these foreign books. And you develop a lot of illustrations in that paper, very beautifully narrated. And it will be useful for my students. He said he will go to university next week and he will scan and send the copy. He must. If I get a copy, I will give it to Ariba next week. If I get a
Sure, sir.
copy, you can
Sure, sir.
circulate
That
them.
would be
Was a very remarkable essay. That's why I'm with Gramsci. Yeah? So his essay. So he's teaching, and that's you can read many things on hegemony. You can today Google Uncle is there. You can search for it, and therefore it's very easy. And but read at least two essays. One by Norbert Bobbio on Gramsci's Civil Society that talks of hegemony, and the other is by Alex Texier, the French Marxist who debated with Bobbio, and both are published in Santal Move's volume Gramsci and Hegemony. That in that volume there are two essays, Bobbio and Texier. Read these two, both for civil society and how civil society performs hegemonic functions.
Thank you, sir. There's one question by Richa Biswas. She thanks you for the enlightening lecture. Her question is there any convergence in the political thought between Gramsci and Ambedkar? Please elucidate this point.
There is a book you must read. One of my friend from SOAS is retired now. He published a book, Gramsci and Ambedkar, the itineraries of subalternity and then its life. It's a book published by Routledge 3 or 4 years back. I reviewed in Economic Political Weekly. So you should read that. It documents the beautiful connection between Gramsci and Ambedkar.
So thank you, sir. Cheriachan Matam, I think. I'm sorry for the name. He wants to know if the civil society around the world is too noisy. It transforms one's argument to its whims and fancies. It labels you and puts you in a different context which suits its hegemonic interest. How can somebody who really wants a radical change engage in such a realm?
That's typical of the left question. That's where civil society, as I said, is a bundle of contradictions. It is true that the dominant form is hegemonic, but you can't wish it away. Remember, there is something necessary for us to learn from hegemony. One thing to learn from hegemony is that hegemony is hegemony because of education. Without education, hegemony will be very weak. It will be on a sketchy foundation. Because hegemony doesn't look hegemonic because of educational program. Hegemony looks benign and power neutral because of education program. Hegemony becomes a normal activity for people who are dominated, who are marginalized. And therefore, they don't question it because they think they are not hegemonized. That being hegemonic and being outed mentally helps hegemony to survive. Now, this process, you can't question it if I'm going outside it. It's necessary to adapt same strategy as hegemony do it. That is, use education program in order to criticize hegemony. Therefore, it is important for us to conduct education program in all fields of civil society institutions, from family to factory to agriculture field to caste organizations to class organizations to economic interests to cultural groups to clubs, etc. Conduct counter hegemonic program, conduct education programs everywhere. And I say the first task of hegemony is to learn from people. You don't learn from people, you try to educate them all the time, then you will be producing a caste system which is much more hostile to emancipation than hegemonic itself. You will be working like hegemon rather than counter hegemon. There is a story of activism in India, and don't follow activists in India. You must try to be critical of them as well.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. That was a very interesting point. Minnati Das wants to know, is asking, considering Indian democracy is in shambles and there is little hope of any dominant party leaning from the ruling party, what's the role of subaltern struggles? If one way to also acknowledge that state increasingly and systematically targets such groups.
Uh, uh, and, see, subalterns always struggle, and the point is, are you willing to listen to them? Subalterns do exercise their, they exercise their negotiation with the power is a form of struggle, and negotiating with power is not very easy. Therefore, when they don't struggle, they do negotiate with power, and they do struggle. Therefore, it is important for us to lend voices to their struggles. And task is not to educate them, but give voices to their struggle and initiate understand their frustration, agony, understand their alienation, understand marginalization, and that is the way to start with. Unfortunately, in the history of activism in India, mainly the communist activism, and to some extent, not so much is not a problem with feminism and Dalit movement. It's more with the communist thinking, where subaltern experience is not weighed as a wise experience. They think subaltern experience is simply fantasizing power, etc. Therefore, there is more hegemony, nothing to learn from it. That de-recognizes subaltern initiatives. A result of this, subalterns are doubly dispossessed, once by state, next by the communist left. Now, this problem is also manifested in the Dalit movement to some extent, and as a result, we find Dalit movement is fragmented. Movement activists don't learn from people. You are likely to witness fraternal wars. See, is by learning from people, activists can be sober and can be humble. They will realize that it is necessary for us to stay together. When you don't learn from people, you become arrogant by yourself. By becoming arrogant yourself, you believe in fraternal war. You think my way or highway. Now, suppose you don't agree with me, you are against me. Now, this attitude is not merely with communists, it's also with Ambedkarite left and feminist left. As I told you, two great feminist intellectuals of city of Hyderabad can't talk to each other. So that is my fate in the whole city. So therefore, the point is, such arrogance comes from the communist thinking. We think my way or highway. Therefore, it is necessary for the all activists, communist activists, feminist activists, and Ambedkarite activists to learn from Gramsci. This has been my singular point from last 30 years that unless they learn from them, they will not come together. They by learning from Gramsci, they will learn from ordinary people. By learning from ordinary people, they will realize that their education program is incomplete. They must come together to educate people. And that therefore they will feel the need to come together. And they will feel the need to overcome fraternal wars they have been carrying out for last, I don't know how the feminist wars can be called, but I call it fraternal wars anyway. We have feminist wars or the communist war, they can be called fraternal wars. War is like a conflict in over fraternity, no? So fraternity is not a simply male-oriented concept; it can be gender-neutral concept as well. So I use the fraternal. All these activists are having a lot of wars among themselves. First, you stop these wars. Learn from ordinary people. Begin to learn from them. You will unlearn yourself. You will stop being arrogant. Once you stop being arrogant, you will stay connected with yourself and with each other. That is the starting point of historical lesson. All the activists in India must learn from Gramsci. The reason why I say because Gramsci is a very important intellectual for us to, he was a communist intellectual. He died as a communist. He died, he passionately argued for reforms, whatever rigidities found in communist movement. Therefore, subaltern voices, subaltern struggles continue to exist with or without activists. Task is to learn from them. And once you learn from them, we will come together. And there will be greater unity and greater historic block.
This was a very
I hope
valuable
I
I
hope I
think
answered Minati Das. I am obsessed with Gramsci, so I hope I answered the question.
no, so I think you have done justice to it.
Mm.
Question wants to know that if there is any, if there is any more, there are more writers who also deal with hegemony apart from Gramsci himself, and if she will can suggest some other writers on Gramsci.
Uh,
Sorry.
hegemony, actually, hegemony is a, yeah, hegemony, of course, there are many people who worked on hegemony for Indian context. You have to also Indianize Gramsci to some extent. The Gramsci was trying to understand hegemony in European context. If we are trying to understand hegemony in Indian context, you must look at people like Lohia, Ambedkar, and how caste tries to normalize manage to survive despite challenges to caste system from time to time. To some extent, Ambedkar addresses this question. Lohia addresses this question very well, and therefore it is important for us to connect Gramsci with Ambedkar's critique of caste, Lohia's critique of caste. Not so much Gandhi, but Ambedkar, Lohia would be useful to connect us with Gramsci. Similarly, of the great thinkers, I could imagine Lohia would be very close to Gramsci. You must read
So-
Lohia. In fact, I have written an essay on Lohia. It published in volume in memory of my friend M.S.S. Pandyan, who died 5 years back. Edited by his wife S. Anandi. You must read my essay where I compare him with Gramsci.
Okay, so we'll try to circulate that in among the participants. Connected to this last question, sir, Abhilash wants to know if we can compare concepts of Gramsci and trusteeship by Gandhi.
That's an interesting concept. Let me say, see, trusteeship, which is somewhat misunderstood by people, and they think it essentially tries to control subalterns in favor of capital. That's not true, but Gandhi puts restrictions on capital as well. So Gandhi argues that capitalist class must win over the trust of ordinary people. It is by winning over the ordinary people. It's true that they may be using hegemony, but question is hegemony also uses a strategy of winning over. But the point here is hegemony tries to also dominate while winning over. Trusteeship tries to break the structure of domination. Trusteeship proposes winning over as a strategy. Gramsci says same thing for counter hegemony. Must win over the subaltern. That is a typical hegemonic tendency. But in counter hegemony, and there was a similarity in counter hegemony and hegemony. Both aim to win over. But difference is in hegemony, winning over subaltern by controlling them. In counter hegemony, you win over subaltern by helping them to grow as intellectuals. I think Gandhi didn't have idea of intellectual agenda. That's why his idea is more or less criticized by people. But same time, he also didn't want capital to dominate over workers. He wanted capital to be friendly with workers. He wanted friendship to grow between the capitalist class and the industrial class. By following, I will give an interesting example. I am planning to study that. No study research has happened, but I want to give an example here. There's an interesting organization called Film Society of Bombay. I forget its name. Sane Workers Association. I think CWA. I think Cine Workers Association. The association was celebrating their 40 years of existence, and in that function, most of the activists, the organizers, leaders, they recounted a story. They said Wadia film industry, which has been existing in the Bombay film industry for last 40 years, there is not a single dispute that has cropped up which has come to their attention. They have been involved in settlement of disputes across film industries, except one industry run by Wadia company. And what they said, all the disputes that arise in the Wadia film unit, the film production unit, with workers were redressed by Wadia film management. And not a single dispute that has cropped up in unit has come outside the unit to union. The union is not even bothered about those issues. Then the inquiry, they found out what is happening. There is no complaint. Then they found that the management has desired reconciliation strategy. They adopted reconciliation team, like Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa. They have designed one kind of commission to settle disputes as and when they crop up. As a result, nobody has come out openly against management. Therefore, no complaint to union. That's they were saying. They said then they found out that they were inspired by Gandhi's idea of trusteeship. We have ideas from Surat. So they run up ship building industry when Gandhi was alive. No, therefore Gandhi was traveling in those ships to different parts. Ambedkar also went. So that's how they have learned from Gandhi that by winning over the trust of workers, by building a trusteeship between management and workers, it is possible to create a social democratic atmosphere in working class condition, and then workers' grievances can be mitigated from time to time. So therefore, last 40 years, there is not a single trade union complaint from the factories of Wadia. This is fantastic. Therefore, trusteeship works like Gramsci's idea, but unlike Gramsci is more interested in not merely winning over, but by developing workers as intellectuals. Gandhi is somewhat silent on that. Therefore, it comes very close to Gramsci, but it falls out of Gramsci's interest that winning over subaltern is not enough. You must win over, yes, but win over so that they become intellectuals.
Thank you, sir. Maggie Paul wants to know how can we use Gramsci to understand conservative civil society, the rise of right-wing nationalism in all spheres of even organized civil society.
Yeah, that's true, but Gramsci would say once you have a right-wing ideology with mass basis, is important for us to understand that the right-wing ideology has a strength, and nobody can, under democratic condition, nobody can exercise pure domination by manipulation of news and information. Nobody can. But people also watching us, no? So therefore, Gramsci would say that if people are supporting right-wing ideology en masse, it's important for us to learn from why they support, what are the reasons they support, and does it indicate that we are weak? Does it indicate we must reform ourselves? Does it indicate we should only criticize the right? Gramsci would not do the latter one. Gramsci would say, we are weak, therefore they are with them. Therefore, it is important. Therefore, this is a way of Gramsci's narration. See, look at the communist left. They simply criticize right-wing ideology, and they think that right-wing ideology is manipulating masses, and masses are in the grip of fear of right-wing forces, television, media, this, that. Houses are manipulated by right-wing ideology, and they captured mass imagination. Masses are with them. By doing so, what are you assuming? You are assuming the masses are fools. Huh? They can be fooled by Times Now. They can be fooled by Republic TV. They can be fooled by Inadu and all the nonsense. Huh? So, only the communist activists are intelligent and masses are fools. Huh? This ideology has let the communists down. First, you must look at your face in the mirror of the right. When you look at the right strength today, it is with masses in large number that has ever happened in India's history. One thing was learned from it, that we have become weak. We have faltered in drawing the imagination of ordinary people to the heart of our ideology. Secularism is weak. It has faltered. It never walked the path. It never walked the talk. It is simply elite ideology. It could not catch the imagination of ordinary people. and therefore people have given up us. And result of this, people have put a lot of faith in us. Yet they experiment with us. They put us up for a long time, longer than what they should have done it. Now they want to take another chance. Therefore, now this is how Gramscian interpretation would be. Gramsci would like to see the face of secularism in the eyes of the Hindu right. Gramsci would not criticize Hindu right by and condone the weakness of the left. Gramsci would say the strength of the Hindu right indicates the weakness of the left. That's typical of Gramsci. So that's why I find Gramsci so stimulating. And he says, look at where we have failed, therefore they have gone with it. And therefore it is important for us to understand. This is an important point I made. And in the secular, if you look at the rise of Hindutva politics in India from 90 to onwards, you are likely to find variation in their ideology and politics. See, I never try to understand a political formation purely by ideological standards. Gramsci makes an interesting distinction. Gramsci and Althusser make an interesting distinction between ideology and politics. Ideology is about belief system. There may be serious problems, etc. But politics is about mass mobilization. And so don't confuse theory with practice. Theory may be deficit, but practice may be different. I written an essay on this in Satyamurthy's volume, 4 volumes on Indian politics. In third volume, my essay is there on ideology and politics and Hindutva. There I argued that Hindutva has learned from anti-caste movements. It has taken anti-caste stance by drawing OBCs and Dalits into Hindutva fold, by offering critique of caste system. It has opened out a front for ordinary people to join it. Now that is a lesson they have learned from the anti-caste movement history. And this is a point missed out thoroughly by, and this essay, my essay was published in 1995. And when I was probably second author in India who wrote on Hindutva. First was Gyan Pandey, that was published in October 94 in Economic Political Weekly. My essay was written before that, but published in a book form. The books takes time, so my paper got published next year. Nobody cited my paper so far. All those who written on Hindutva, Mandarikaju, Jyotirma Sarma, Raghuram Raju, many others, have fairly ignored my paper. By ignoring my paper, ignoring Antonio Gramsci, you ignore your own history. And where is the Hindu right now? 1995 till 2014. Where is Hindu right now? Have we ignored it? Have we tried to suppress it? It has gone bigger and bigger. By ignoring Gramsci, by ignoring history, you have let Hindu right grow bigger and bigger. My dear comrades, please wake up. Read Gramsci carefully.
Thank you, sir. Related to this question is by Sanjay Bisoi. He is asking you if you refer to RSS, the right-wing organization which work for nationalist cultural hegemony, while talking about Gramsci's influences, as RSS tries to accommodate Dr. Ambedkar by interpreting his thoughts in a way that suits their political agenda. Please comment on this.
No, RSS is learning all the time. In my view, to see the learning curve of RSS and left, I have actually I'm writing essay on this. Learning curve of RSS is higher than the learning curve of the liberal and the left. Liberal left learning curve is going down. RSS learning curve is going up. There are deficits in the RSS scheme. I agree, but I'm talking about learning curve. Learning curve, you see the graphically is going up. I know how many times I have documented several places. RSS learned from the left liberals all the time. Left liberals have not learned from RSS any time. Remember Gramsci, the moment you learn from the enemy, strength of the enemy, you become hegemon. I hope I have answered the question.
Yes, sir, you have done it well, sir. Thank you. Nilanjan Banerjee wants to know, is Gramsci related to critical theory school of Frankfurt?
It is, partly, not fully. Critical Frankfurt school is basically hermeneutic thinking, but Gramsci is partly hermeneutic and partly not. Is partly structural Marxism, partly hermeneutic. About the binary between structural Marxism and hermeneutic Marxism, critical theory Marxism. His project is more, I could say, historical materialism rather than this brand or that brand of Marxism. He avoids binary conflict in the left camp. Therefore, I won't say he's firmly in the hermeneutic camp.
Okay, so thank you. Sashikant Acharya wants to know how Gramsci's hegemony and Foucault's power dynamics are the same, if they are the same.
No, they are not. It is similarity, but they are not same because in case of Foucault, power relationship assume that it operates successfully by normalizing subaltern existence. For Gramsci, the normalizing is only notional. For Foucault, normalizing is real. That's the difference, huge difference. The moment we say normalizing function of power is notional, not real, you you believe that subalterns retain the gray area of resistance. They resist power relationship as power relationship tries to normalize them. Therefore, then the power relationship, hegemonic relationship, always negotiate with the counter hegemonic tendencies with subalterns who always resist their marginalization. See, for to make subalterns aware of their marginalization, we don't need Gramsci or Ambedkar. Dalits know that how Brahminism is oppressive. They don't need Ambedkar to tell them how Brahminism is oppressive for them. They don't need. Similarly, they don't need workers don't need Gramsci to tell them that capitalism is oppressive. They know it by their habit, by their experience. That experience produces beautiful narration of good sense. Therefore, that's point Gramsci makes is that never think that workers, Dalits are full of superstition. They are, but they are not. The good sense, they know what is good for them. They know that they are being marginalized by capitalism, by Brahminism. They know that they must resist their marginalization by Brahminism and capitalism. They need Ambedkar, they need Gramsci to help a way out. Are we ready for that? That is a typical Gramscian question.
Thank you, sir. There have been many comments where people are thanking you for such a good lecture and they request you to please share your articles with them. So I'll
I,
forward to do that.
I will send you all my papers.
Sure, sir. Thank you, sir. And there is one person, Cheriachan Matan, who wants to ask the question directly to you. So I invite Cherian Matan to please ask the question, sir, directly.
Hello.
Yeah, please.
Hi, sir. I am a student of your student, Ren Gupta.
Okay.
Hello.
Okay. Yeah.
So my question is this, sir. Like Gramsci's thoughts have taken little forward, I think, by Antonio Negri and or by by their understanding of empire and multitude. So like civil society, as I understand it now, it seems like a dialectical thing. But I think this empire and multitude is more non-dialectical and strictly opposes, the movie Matrix, where the power of this like hegemonic power is almost like an undefeatable thing. But the only solution, I think, is to struggle like without that much faith in winning, which is a typical a Gandhian kind of question, which you mentioned, Gandhian kind of activism or something. And I
Right.
also think that Gandhi really tried to place like the periphery to the center by uh, by giving many contribution to the political theory, especially in Hind Swaraj and his constructive programs, all that. But how do you see all of these things? Your comments?
You're putting too many questions. I told you, I answered Gandhi partly. I said Gandhi project is slightly not satisfactory because there is no intellectual development for subalterns. So his trusteeship tries to retain the hegemonic relationship in a way because it restrains capital from running away by accumulating profit, but same time it doesn't help workers to become intellectuals. So therefore, trusts have a limited role. I don't think Gandhi could overcome that problem, despite having a bit of a social democratic agenda in that idea of trustship. But that is only economic agenda rather than a social intellectual agenda, in my view. So counter-hegemony must have intellectual agenda. Therefore, that's missing in Gandhi's idea of trustship. Or idea of Swaraj. Even Swaraj doesn't talk about that. For especially urban India. For rural India, again, Gandhi's idea is very vague and very fuzzy. What about Swaraj for Dalits? That question will be posed by Ambedkar. So Gandhi's idea is very vague here and not very clear. But many Gandhians have experimented with Gandhi as well, differently. That there's a complex way of looking at it. I will not able to give much time on that. But the fact that they look at the caste system, which has not been dismantled, it has continued to survive with us despite having powerful critics of caste. We must try to be eclectic and learn from everybody. Learn from Gandhi partly, from Jayaprakash Narayan, from Lohia, from Ambedkar. And Ambedkar will not be enough to destroy caste system by banking on Dalit politics. Ambedkar was purely banking on Dalit politics, and therefore the project remains incomplete. And Dalit politics has been fragmented by internal wars, partly because of the communist influence on them, and partly because of their own narrow-mindedness. So now maybe I am deviating from the actual answer, but question is there are complexities in your question. You have posed too many questions. I don't know how to answer them, but if I understand correctly, it's important for us to learn from everybody, to build a political coalition of subaltern movement in order to see that subaltern movement produces its own intellectuals who remain with them, who fight for them, and die for them.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
I think with this we can
Thank
end
you,
the
sir.
question. I think with this we end the question answer session. I now
Thank you.
Asta Binzani, research scholar, Department of Political Science, Banaras Hindu University, to give the vote of thanks. Over to you, Asta.
Thank you, Ariba, for this opportunity. I would like to convey our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Arun Patnaik for taking out time from his busy schedule and for giving such an enlightening and insightful lecture on Gramsci's political thoughts. I would also like to thank all the participants for joining us today. The participation has helped us become an enlivening experience. I would like to extend my thanks to the President of AIRS, Ariba Muazzam, for her tireless efforts, which have made this event possible. I would also like to thank Narendra Jarwal, Isuddin Ali Muazzam, Zeba Muazzam, Rajesh Kumar, and Evangeline Nongclaw for their help with making this lecture a success. Thank you. Over to you, Ariba.
Thank you, Asta,
Asta.
for succinctly giving the vote of thanks. I want to once again thank you, sir, for making this such a beautiful, successful lecture. Some people have commented saying somebody who had such a long engagement with a thinker can only be efficient and be able to argue on all fronts. And I think your engagement with Gramsci for so long is reflected every time you talk on any theme. Thank you once again, sir. I hope you join us again once again to talk on other aspects of Gramsci and other political thinkers as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a great day, and I hope to see all of you at our next lecture on November 7th by Director of Quixote Global, Nuno Rodriguez from Madrid, Spain, on psychological warfare, theory and practical implications. Good day and goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.